how to prepare and what to know. There's a lot of federal incentives coming out around this and a lot of movement towards electrification. So we're excited to share this topic and those that are interested. Please feel free to put any questions or comments in the chat throughout the presentation. I'll keep an eye on that and monitor it. And we will have some time for question and discussion at the end of the presentation as well. I'll also be sharing a few links to some resources in the chat, so keep an eye on those as well. And I will hand it over to Kevin here to start the presentation.
Great, thanks, Lauren. Thank you everyone for being here. We have a larger group than usual for the sustainability series, so that's exciting. And thanks to our friends at CERTS, and apparently maybe CERTS boards across the whole state, and people from across the whole state that might be joining us. So a little bit of background on myself. My name is Kevin Bright. I've worked in sustainability for 15 years as a sustainable design consultant, energy manager, energy auditor, commissioning expert, or commissioning authority at least. And then also ran sustainability programs at a small college in Maine, and now for the Destination Medical Center project, and help with some city stuff with Lauren too. As it relates to heat pumps, I put a heat pump in my own home 2 years ago, and have worked through this process and some of the frustrations. And I thought, if I can create a slide deck to help other people become a little bit more aware of what they're getting into, that would probably be helpful. So this is a course that I developed for community ed here in Rochester, and we offer it twice a year. So if folks think this is decent information and others might benefit from it, feel free to let them know that there's other opportunities to catch this. Also, just a side note, we'll share the recording of the slides after today as well. So meant to learn. So if you have questions or things on your minds, fire away. From an agenda perspective, we're going to talk a little bit about energy conservation, but then really get into the process of what it takes to convert your home from probably what might be a natural gas furnace to a home heat pump. A lot of this presentation is based off of the Rewiring America Electrify Home Guide. So if you are not familiar with that resource, this presentation will look very similar to that and kind of the process that it outlines. It also has a calculator so you can help understand how the Inflation Reduction Act might benefit your personal household too, both from a subsidy perspective and then also tax credit perspective. So this heat pump conversion that we'll discuss today is supported by the Inflation Reduction Act and does have some pretty ambitious, or not ambitious, but healthy subsidies and tax credit opportunities for folks that are working through a heat pump conversion. So just setting the groundwork for a little bit of why or what the impact of converting to a heat pump might be for your home. Homes in Minnesota use a lot of energy to heat and air condition, so 55%. So if you're interested in starting to reduce the energy consumption within your home, starting with the biggest energy users within it and working to the smallest ones is a pretty tried and true practice, and one that many energy managers that are managing huge portfolios of buildings work through as well. So this just gives you a general understanding of what the opportunity is, but there's a lot of opportunity to save energy by converting to a heat pump. The second part of this too is just reinforcing that a heat pump conversion is money most well spent when it follows an energy audit and some energy efficiency improvements within your home. So if you insulate first, if you make your envelope as tight as it possibly can, and then replace it with a heating system that's appropriately sized as a result of those improvements, that's really where your home and energy bills, your home feels more comfortable and your energy bills start to minimize. So in terms of what is a good energy efficiency investment, there's very smart people at the Department of Energy that already think about this stuff on a daily basis and create really friendly, nice charts. So this is kind of a energy conservation measure prioritized list that shows the net cost or net savings in electricity, as well as their the net cost. So basically how this can help improve the energy efficiency of your home. And they are prioritized to just show the impact of these interventions on the energy consumption of your home itself. Then you see there's a lot of electricity saving opportunities with number 10 here in the light blue called Upgrade Electric Furnace to Variable Speed Heat Pump, VSHP, at wear out. So what we're not saying is rip out a furnace that is 5 years old and replace it with a heat pump. But if your home is or has an aging heat pump like mine did when I moved into it, it's my furnace was about 22 years old, and needing to think about a new heating system. We wanted to put this information together to say you should consider a heat pump, and they work in Minnesota, and we'll talk about why today. The short answer why is they're quite efficient. It is an opportunity perhaps that you can make ventilation improvements at the same time. In Rochester, we have a pathway to carbon-free heating with a heat pump conversion in 2030 because Rochester Public Utility has committed to become 100% renewable electricity utility by 2030. So by transitioning to a heat pump, you will have carbon-free heating in your home. And then every conversion of home or building or business within Rochester, but any town or municipality in Minnesota will contribute to your city's greenhouse gas targets if you have them. So heating equipment life. The first thing to really kind of keep in mind is that you probably shouldn't tear out a good piece of equipment before it's ready to do so. So there's something published by ASHRAE, or the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, Air Conditioning Engineers. That's called the, basically they just predict the useful life of equipment. So for furnaces, gas or oil, it's 18 years. For air conditioning units, it's 15 years. So if in your home you have a furnace or an air conditioning unit that's lived longer than that, that's great news. But it also might be time to think about what a replacement might be and how that might work for your house. And that was really kind of the process that I took in my home as well. Kind of the first step, if you're thinking about a heat pump replacement for your furnace or air conditioning unit, is to confirm the electric service in your home. Older homes may have smaller electric service, think 100 amps or less. Newer homes typically have about 200 amp service. In my home in particular, it was built in 1965, so we had 100 amp service to our house. That was kind of pretty much already full. So in order to consider a heat pump or do some other things that we were interested in doing, like owning an electric car, we know we needed to upgrade our electric service in order to help create more room within our panel to provide power to those things that we'd like to electrify in the future. Fortunately, in the Inflation Reduction Act, one of the things that the federal government is offering to either subsidize or provide a tax credit around is upgrading electric panels. So that's covered as part of that act itself, to benefit homeowners. If you don't know how to confirm your electric service, this is how you do it. You could look at the electric meter itself. It might read CL 200, which signifies a 200 amp service. If you don't want to walk outside because it's cold, you can go down the electric panel in your basement and look for the label by the manufacturer itself or the inspector after you open it. And it should be labeled right on that main breaker or fuse within your home electric panel. So have the capacity itself written on there. Well, let's say you go down and look at it and say, oh, it's only 100 amp service. What do I do next? First one is to call your utility and figure out what the maximum service available to your house might be. And consider an upgrade to a 200 amp service. It probably won't be necessary to just for that level of service to integrate a heat pump in your home. If you have a 100 amp service, for instance, 150 amps would probably be plenty, depending on the type of unit that you're looking at. But if you're also wanting to electrify other energy loads within your home, let's say converting your stove from a gas stove to an electric stove, if you're thinking about an electric car in the future, talking about what the maximum available to you is a great place to start, and probably looking at a 200 amp service would be great. The second recommendation I have for you is to call 3 electrical contractors in order to help with this work itself. So within that Electrify Everything guide, the expected cost can be anywhere from $750 to $4,000. And the Bright House, it was my house, I'll refer to it as the Bright House, was $3,000. The reason that was towards the higher end of that amount was that not only was I getting a new service, I also had to move it because building codes have changed over the past 70 years, and our electric panel was originally directly underneath our sewer and water pipe service in our house, which is a no-no. We all, I think, know that water and electricity don't mix well, and that building code has carried that forward to say they shouldn't be located next to each other either. So part of mine was moving the panel and then upgrading the panel. And that cost me, in my experience, $3,000 to do so. So some key questions for you to consider, and I've kind of rattled these off a little bit as part of the presentation already, but while the contractor's on site, it's a great opportunity to talk through maybe what are your other goals for your house, short, medium, or long term. So like appliances, or considering some of these appliances that you'd like to electrify long term, and then do you need extra plugs or things that you'd like to power in the future? Like a heat pump, hot water heater is a good one. We mentioned induction stoves or electric stoves and ovens, heat pump dryers or electric vehicle chargers. These are all things that you might not have in your home already, but things you might want to consider and would all require power in order to work, and as well as ample room within your electric panel in order to power them and connect those loads to your house. So thinking about what your service is now, what your service would like to be, should have some consideration around what are your goals long-term about things that you'd like to electrify in the future. The second part of this, beyond the service, is then to start thinking about what size equipment does your house need. So the electric panel thing, talking to the right people, electric contractor and utility provider will get you in a really good place. The next step is, let's say you had an energy audit done in your home, you've done some energy improvements within your home. The question then is, what size of equipment do you need in order to appropriately heat and cool your house? In my experience for our house, it's right, a 1965 home. When we moved in, we did a lot of insulation work because that hadn't been done before that. So we air sealed and insulated our attic. We air sealed and insulated our basement. And then we addressed some issues with windows and door undercuts throughout the home to basically just tighten things up and limit the amount of drafts that are happening. A lot of them kind of pointed out directly on this graphic that you see on the slide in front of you. And in doing those things and insulating our house ensures that we don't have to necessarily have as big of a heating system and cooling system in order to make our home feel comfortable in the future. To put it in very distinct and clear perspective, I had an 80,000 BTU furnace for an 1,800 square foot home. This was vastly oversized and led to equipment cycling happening within my house, which, if you're not familiar with that term, means my furnace would kick on for about 5 minutes. Because it was so oversized, it would provide a ton of heat to my house, quickly reach temperature and turn off. And then the temperature would inevitably drop, and then it would kick on for 5 minutes again in order to heat the house, and then kick off, and repeat this 10, 15 times in the middle of winter over the course of a cold day. That process of turning your equipment on and off so many times a day isn't good for it. When it's on, you'd like it to run for definitely longer than 5 minutes in order to get just prevent kind of this short cycling from happening on, off, on, off, on, off. Just I imagine my 6-year-old flicking on a light switch in his room on and off. That's not how we want to be nice to our furnace equipment, stuff that we rely on for heating in our house, because that could damage reduce its life long term. So one way that you could do this is ask, let's say you're talking to an HVAC representative that offers heat pumps, their familiarity with or experience with conducting manual J load calculations. What manual J load calculations are basically understanding the amount of energy that your home loses over the course of each day, and really in design conditions. So when it's really cold out, how much energy is lost through your walls, window systems, attic, and other areas, to then size a piece of equipment that can deliver that amount of heat in that worst case scenario. Doing these energy improvements like insulation and air leakages calculation should then be modified in order to account for those things that are done to improve the envelope of your house itself. And then another good question for them is, what type of software will they use in order to conduct this calculation? It doesn't have to be done by a computer, but it's a good way to understand if the company itself has any familiarity with conducting these. By asking exactly what software do you use would lead to some further assurance that they know what they're doing, or perhaps not. The next thing is Manual J, talking about that. The other one is to find a contractor, and asking for suggestions from your personal network within your community might be a good way to get started. So for instance, there's a small group of people within Rochester that have converted their homes to heat pumps that all are now helping support others who are considering this too, by sharing which contractors they reached out to, which ones they ended up working with. Fortunately, the state is also working on this as well and created the Minnesota Air Source Heat Pump Collaborative that's linked here. The ones that are regional or listed on there to Rochester are listed on that website. And then there are others that are doing work here locally, like Superior Mechanical, Tana, that maybe aren't on that list yet, but do have some experience installing heat pumps as well. And then again, when you're working with a contractor to figure out exactly what it is you'd like them to provide you a bid on, it's also some questions that maybe help things for you to think about heading into this process, and also ways that a contractor can really help you make this a successful project. So the Manual J for heat load calculations, we already talked about. Asking for their help in submitting any incentives on your behalf to the electric utility is another good one, because there's typically some information around serial numbers, model numbers, and other things, that information that they'll have at their fingertips that might require a little bit more effort from you to pull together in order to submit. So asking for their help to do so and having that be part of their scope is a good idea. Asking about inverter-driven heat pumps. So basically the fact that they're variable speed meaning they modulate fan speed, but also fan speed of the heat pump itself, as well as fan speed of the furnace is a possibility, but we'll talk about that in a second. But inverter speed or variable speed heat pumps, basically saying they modulate how much energy they're using based on the outside air temperature that they're operating within. So if it's 40 degrees and your thermostat calls for heating, you don't need your heat pump to run 100% to provide heat to your house in that condition. If it's minus, or if it's 5 degrees or 0 degrees out, your heat pump will probably need to run close to 100% in order to help heat your house in those conditions. But being able to modulate in between that worst case condition and other conditions that your home might experience all helps save energy. So asking for an inverter driven or variable speed is a good idea. Identifying where you're going to mount the outdoor unit. It definitely should be above the ground because there's some ice forming condensation that happens when you put in a home heat pump that if placed along a sidewalk, for instance, could make that sidewalk really slippery, or access to your basement or wherever that walkway might do or might go. But also keeping it above ground, make sure that the ice that forms underneath it will not block the surface area of the heat pump itself, in order to make sure it's operational for a long period of time. And then the second one, or the last part on here, is a pretty important one too, is thinking about backup heat. So heat pumps work in Minnesota. Some work down to minus 14 degrees or minus 20 degrees. And then there are models that really are only functional to outdoor air temperatures to 5 degrees or 10 degrees above zero. So in some cases, or in many cases, you'll need to think about what is that backup heat for when outside air temperatures perhaps fall below minus 15 or fall below 5 degrees or 10 degree outside air temperature. There have been situations that I'm aware of here in town that folks have used their existing gas furnace that might be at 18 years of its life, but really only run that when absolutely needed. Like when it's super cold out, the heat pump won't be operational. Their furnace will provide heat in those conditions, but have the heat pump operate the rest of the time. In my case, I elected for an electric coil backup heat, which kicks on when temperatures drop below 5 degrees outside air temperature. The reason for my selection of that heat pump I'll get into too as part of this presentation today, and then probably the next 2 minutes here. But also on page 26 of the guide that I already mentioned has a great list of questions too that build upon this as well. So take a look at that. But to dive into this electric or gas backup heat a little bit farther, or a little bit more, I should say, is that there's these general ranges that heat pumps can work in outside air temperatures. And trying to identify the one that works best for your home is really kind of the key. So in my house, for instance, the ductwork was already sized, already within the wall cavity, and really couldn't be easily increased in its volume in order to account for a stronger airflow that might move through it. So I was definitely interested in I would say a best heat pump, or one that worked down to minus 15 degrees. But what I quickly realized and found out was that due to the limitation of the size of my ducts, I would be forcing a lot of air through a very narrow cavity, which would create probably some noise issues within my home if we went with that model. So then we were left in the situation of trying to figure out what's the most efficient heat pump that we can have that won't make it sound like we're living in an airline terminal or whatever, or like have a jet go by every time our heating system turns on. And just to make sure perfectly clear here, below these temperatures that are on this good, better, best, that means the heat pump will no longer be operational and will rely on backup heat in order to make that work. So this is a consideration for many, if not most, homeowners in Minnesota to figure out. And then the chart on the right just compares the fuel cost expectations around a natural gas, a cold climate heat pump, oil, propane, electric baseboard systems, and what you can expect from an annual heating cost comparison. And then we also just put in the cost for those different utilities below. So then a few other considerations when you're selecting your equipment. So for a furnace backup, if this is a situation that you elect and decide to move forward with, thinking about how this would be controlled, like do you need a separate thermostat in order to control your furnace or transition from a heat pump to your furnace being operational? Not all systems need to, but that's definitely a question you'd want to ask your contractor if that's the direction you're headed in. And then also, depending on what your goals are for your home, is thinking about how you might limit the operation of that furnace. In my house, for instance, our goal was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and ideally get off natural gas heating if we can. So that directed us towards an electric heat pump with an electric resistance backup. The one thing I'll put out there is gas costs have been highly volatile the past couple years. And I don't anticipate that to stop, particularly given impacts of climate change in general, just like climate weirding that's going on, where we're seeing more situations of extreme cold and extreme heat. And it's really in those extreme cold snaps where there's a huge nationwide call for natural gas kind of all simultaneously. So that was part of my concern in working through my own home renovation, was not wanting to experience that volatility of natural gas prices, and saw less volatility with electric costs long term. Again, my own personal opinion, but things I thought I'd share. And then for electric backup reminders, again, this is contingent on your electric service. So let's say you have enough room in your panel for a heat pump conversion, but not enough room in your panel to put an electric resistance backup. That could drive you into a furnace backup situation. And then the other one that I wanted to mention is if you're moving electric resistance, is that integrated in part of the heat pump system itself? And I'll spend a second on this, but in the bids that I received, there were situations where the manufacturer would sell the heat pump, and then as part of their system in the air handling unit, also had an integrated electric coil as part of their system. And that sent a signal to me that this manufacturer is already accounting for the fact that they know how to control the heat pump as well as the electric resistance heat. And I'm not going to be in situations where they're both running at the same time, or they don't know when they should run. That's in comparison to other bids that I received, where we were receiving a heat pump and the contractor was saying we could cut in a separate electric coil into your air handling unit that we could still control through this networked control that they were offering, but it wasn't integrated as part of the heat pump system. And that made me a little concerned, because ideally the manufacturer of the heat pump and the air handling unit are setting up a backup heat system that would work. And if it's all integrated into one package, that sends a signal, at least to me in my situation, that they're pretty sure they're all going to work together and be able to be controlled effectively and efficiently. But that might not always be the case. And with that cutting in situation, that made me a little hesitant to consider those options, because I wasn't confident in how those might work when it's really cold out. And when I'm relying on this, the last place I want to be is worrying about which thermostat needs to be on or how to control these pieces of equipment. I just wanted it to work. I might just pause there. Lauren, are there any questions in the chat or anything, or should we wait to the end, do you think?
We did just have one come up regarding backup heat. Any knowledge or experience to share related to wall-mounted electric cove heaters, performance, comfort, etc. Cove would be an alternative to electric baseboard backup if the home does not have a complete ductwork.
Good question. I don't have personal experience with the Cove system, though I have worked on projects that have, or am aware of home projects too, that have put an electric resistance backup separately and are controlled by local thermostats in the room. Those work too. It's just kind of just thinking through how that might work with your family or, you know, the people that you're living with. And do they all understand how to stay warm in these spaces long term? So I'm not familiar with that Cove system, but intrigued to look at more information. But basically, that they would work the same way. Their efficiency would be very similar, if not exactly the same, due to its electric resistance. So I think that's a strong possibility for sure for being something useful. Moving to selecting equipment and reading efficiency ratings. So this is really kind of where you're understanding the level of efficiency that you might be experiencing with your heat pump. Here in Rochester, our utility company does a good job of providing incentives for pieces of equipment that achieve certain efficiency ratings, both in the heating seasonal performance factor and then also in the cooling season during the summer and their seasonal energy efficiency rating. So you'll see kind of those minimums that are included in there for both that kind of separate, you know, a good heat pump performance from best, to give you a better understanding of what those ranges might be. And then also include the electric heat comparison, just as to help you understand that heat pumps are a more efficient source than electric resistance and gas furnaces, because they're able to take the heat out of the air and combine it with the electricity itself, and this moving the refrigerant through the compression cycle in order to only increase the amount of heat that's within that refrigerant line and then share it with your house. And there are obviously heat pumps that are more efficient at doing that than others. So keep these numbers in mind as you're looking at equipment, and you can get a sense of where the specific equipment you're being quoted from a contractor might fall. And then I would also refer you to your utility incentives, to make sure that whatever equipment you're thinking about buying reaches those minimum performance standards that are published by your utility company too. So finding a contractor, just some best practices, making sure that the questions you have are answered sufficiently. I think most people have the wherewithal to figure out, you know, if the answers they're getting are something they think are true, or maybe hearing some things that might not be totally meet their expectations, and maybe have more questions as a result of that. So again, talking within your network, but also going into those conversations as an interview, right? If, like there's work to be done, and you want to make sure that the work that you want to be done in your house is meeting your expectations. So having those questions, getting those answers is a good way to do that. Defining the scope itself. So if you're asking for a bid or figure out the system you want, being clear on what aspects of that system are important to you. And then as you're getting 3 quotes, making sure that you're sharing that same scope with all 3 contractors or more, to make sure that you're getting an apples to apples quote from these contractors. So one that you can compare to another and not be surprised later on to find that a certain portion of the project scope wasn't addressed or incorporated in their scope of work. But all that to say, make sure that you understand the type of heat pump and its size, the backup heat is identified, the performance of the system that you want is determined, the incentive applications are built into that scope as much as possible. And then again, if there's other improvements that you want to make if you're replacing a furnace in your house, I'll talk about a case study in a second here of my home. But those are good things to keep in front of you. And again, that statewide list has a list of contractors that have gone through some third-party review and recommendation. So financing options are on this slide in front of you. So thinking about rebates, and again, Rochester Public Utility provides incentives for heat pumps that have reached the end of its useful life. There are now tax credits and incentives. The subsidy from the Inflation Reduction Act should be figured out this summer at some point, but the tax credits are included in that resource that we shared at the beginning. And then other financing options. So the home equity line of credit, something to consider. There's a lot of different ways that you can see how you might pay for a furnace replacement, and that it's not always expected, and it's maybe not the most fun thing to spend as a home improvement project, but definitely an important one, especially during the winter time. But there are banks and lenders that some more up on energy efficiency or home improvement projects, but most have like a HELOC opportunity, home equity line of credit that folks could look into. In terms of the rebates, I posted this from rpu.org, and it was from 2022, so some of these performance thresholds might have changed. But again, making sure they're met within the equipment, you're considering other incentive opportunities as well. So in my house, we put in a new heat pump, but we also put in a smart thermostat at the same time. And most utility companies have programs that align with these home interventions, home projects too. The part that why we're really sharing this and started to create some community education around this is because of this Inflation Reduction Act opportunity, and that there are kind of two pathways for homeowners to take advantage of in order to help the federal government or have the federal government pay for a portion of your project. So the upfront discounts are pretty sizable and meant to help support low or moderate income households electrify. So some of the total amounts of upfront discounts are listed here. Just to be clear, homes will only qualify for this full amount depending on income thresholds or the amount of income that your household makes. So keep that in mind as you're looking at the upfront discounts list, but then there's also tax credits included in the Inflation Reduction Act, which are listed here on this slide. And using this IRA calculator link that's on the slide here that I think Lauren has put in the chat as well is a good reference in order to help figure out what funding might be available in order to make these changes in your house. So tax credits available now, the subsidies on this previous slide yet to be figured out, likely this summer. But working through the calculator is a great place to start. We did include some financing options here. So I mentioned a HELOC, but there's energy efficient mortgages, there's renovation loans, there's credit unions that maybe have more of an initiative or focus on green energy or sustainability or some other community initiatives that they're supporting. So there is a national credit union focused on clean energy lending that's listed here, just a FAQ page. But how all these add up is thinking about incentives, any IRA discounts, and any IRA tax credits, and then whatever loan, or if you want to pay cash, you can do that too, to comprise your project budget. But with the introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a couple opportunities for how that might reduce the cost of the overall project itself. So I've referenced my home a little bit. Now we'll just get into a short case study in the remaining minutes just to help hopefully solidify some of the things I said in the remaining kind of 8 minutes, so we have plenty of time for questions. But we moved in the home in 2017. The furnace and air conditioner were 25 years old. There's limited insulation and it was well maintained, but just not very energy efficient. This is just kind of a timeline that I worked through in my own home, listing both the energy improvements, but also the heat pump replacement that we undertook in 2021, along with the electric panel upgrade that we undertook at that time too. I guess the thing I would say is there was a cost premium to install a heat pump. And I'll talk through some of the bids, but to just go through the home energy audit findings, right? I don't think any of these would be surprising to anybody that's gone through an energy audit for their home, but air seal and insulate their attic to R60 would insulate the basement rim joists themselves in order to prevent air leakage from that area where the wood framing of your house meets the concrete foundation. And then we're insulating the cantilever between the first and second floor this summer in order to help limit some air intrusion there too. So you'll see a picture of that there. All these kind of lead to energy savings, but also thermal comfort within your home. Oh, wrong direction. We did some LED lighting. Again, this is part of a community ed presentation, so I'll just kind of skim through some of these things. We did replace all of our water fixtures and a few of our toilets within our house because they were aged and old, and the toilet itself had like a 3-gallon tank. So every time we flushed, it sounded like an entire pond was being emptied into our sewer system. So replacing those with a 1.28 gallon per flush fixture made a big difference, both in just operation, but also noise in our house. So there's a lot about all this to say, there's a lot of ways that you can save energy and resources within your home. And these are some good ideas. But to talk about specifically the home heating and cooling system. So we had an existing gas furnace that was 80,000 BTUs and 23 years old. We received 3 quotes and they ranged widely, which is why I put in here to strongly suggest you get 3 quotes for this work, because mine ranged from $9,500 to $20,000. And they were the same scope from 3 different vendors. What we ended up selecting was a 3-ton Bosch heat pump system that works down to 5 degrees outside air temperature with a 15 kilowatt electric backup. And again, this system, Bosch already kind of understood that they would have that electric resistance heater part of the controlled system, and that was part of my interest in moving forward with it. You can see the SEER and heating performance factors there, and then just some utility comparison costs. So from March 20 to 2021, when we had a gas furnace system, my house spent almost $1,250 on utilities. After the heat pump replacement, that climbed to $1,491. But that difference in cost didn't account for that increase in gas cost during that same time that happened over the pandemic. So assuming that gas is $9.50 a therm, which is kind of close to where it is offered now, falls to about an $85 difference between these 2 systems. So when I was talking about natural gas prices being highly volatile and just last year even, that has a huge impact over how the payback period or kind of the life cycle cost analysis of the heat pump system might work. But for me, again, there's other reasons that I was doing this besides just energy efficiency. There's air quality improvements by not having a furnace in your home, and then just the equipment needed to be replaced, period. So I think we're pretty well set up in the future, and we've had a couple winters under our belt at this point, almost 2, and it's worked well. It's kept our home warm and pretty limited financial exposure over that same time period too. We still have some goals, things that we want to do, and ways that we can help, further reduce the amount of energy that our home's consuming. That we'll continue to do on, and then we're also looking at an electric vehicle, car, and other things. So eating up some of the additional service space that we have in our electric panel moving forward, we're going to continue to act on. But all this to say, please don't assume or think that you're on this journey alone. There's a lot of people likely in your town thinking about these things. There are definitely in Rochester, and then use the internet and trusted sources. So we've already listed a couple today. The Department of Energy, any federal government website provides good information about the efficiencies of these systems in order to help you understand, does this make sense for your house? And then if you live in Rochester and are interested in ways to tap into sustainability conversations or find a network of people that might be helpful, and have some thoughts or suggestions for you as if you're thinking about a home heat pump conversion, there's some great opportunities and groups here where these kind of conversations are held here locally in Rochester. So if you don't know, feel free to reach out to me or Lauren. We can include our emails to help plug you in officially if that's something you're interested in. But otherwise, really appreciate the time. Hope this was informative and answered a few questions, but also happy for hang out and answer any other questions that folks may have too. So thank you.
We do have some questions in the chat. I can start working through those. There was one just clarifying that I assume with dual fuel, it's necessary to have gas, natural or propane as backup. Yes.
Sorry, one more time. I was reading the chat and I should have meant you know.
I think they're just clarifying. It says, I assume with dual fuel, it's necessary to have gas, natural or propane backup.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. If you're going in a dual fuel scenario, those are a couple of your options, right? Electric resistance works too as a backup. But yeah, I mean, I guess the thrust of the argument I was trying to make was as much as possible using equipment that still has some useful life to it is probably a good idea. So even if it's a 17-year-old furnace and you're putting in a heat pump, keeping that around as a backup option for you might work well for your situation. It's something to look at for sure.
A question on, for those that rent, any way to approach and support property managers and making homes or units more efficient and comfortable, especially when renters are responsible for the energy bills. I did share the IRAs. They have a checklist for renters and additional information on things to talk to your landlord about. If you have anything else to add to that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think one, it probably all starts with the conversation with the landlord. If those are things that you're interested in doing, it also is tied to the age of the equipment itself. So if you're living in a place, an apartment complex that was built about 15 to 18 years ago, they should probably be starting to think about new heating and cooling systems for their building anyways. So that might be a good opportunity entree. If heating and cooling systems for a rental situation are not on the table or something that they're willing to talk about, you do have a good amount of autonomy of ways that you can save energy within your home too. Fortunately, we have a community ed class that talks about those things, but some of the very measures that I mentioned today around lighting improvements, plumbing improvements, other things like that are all good places to start thinking about your thermostat and replacing that. You might not all get these investments back in terms of a payback if you're making these improvements within your apartment. That said, again, if it helps you save energy and that's your goal, those are all worthwhile activities to pursue.
How well does a heat pump work for cooling on extremely hot days, 100+ degrees?
Same as an air conditioner would in your house. It's basically the same thing. So if your air conditioner can do it now, your heat pump, if sized properly, will be able to do that too.
What were the SEER and HSPF of the system you bought?
SEER rating was 17.5, HSPF was 9.5. So the heating season, 9.5. That worked down to 5 degrees outside air temperature, which again, wasn't my ideal going into it, but what I ended up with with those other considerations around noise.
Any knowledge or experience to share related to performance of ducted heat pump systems versus multi-zone ductless heat pumps with distribution points and multiple locations via line sets, no ducts?
Yeah, so I'm assuming that's like a variable refrigerant system. Not in my own home, but there's been other commercial projects where I've been a part of that have used variable refrigerant flow systems. They work well too. I think you still need to be cognizant and aware of kind of what are those operating conditions in which the variable refrigerant flow system can work. But that's another good option to think about and consider. And again, a lot of the same thinking and kind of consideration would apply to the sizing of that system and its operation. Just the same, like all the same things that we covered today, just take out a home heat pump and put in a variable refrigerant system, but all the same thinking and guidance would be the same. From a performance standpoint, there might be a little difference in the efficiency, but it's the same technology, so they'd be pretty close.
Any additional information regarding heat pump systems with integrated backup heat? Bosch was mentioned. Any other products or manufacturers who are doing this as well?
I'm not familiar off the top of my head, just based on my own experience.
Okay.
But if you're scoped a piece of equipment and you get the specification for that equipment from the manufacturer, really the thing to do is look at what the options are, the accessories. And in my case, an option was backup electric heat, 15 kilowatt heater. That was all part of the Bosch system. So if it's included on that, specification sheet for the equipment itself, it's an integrated system. If it's not, and something that in the scope of work, the contractor is saying, here's the heat pump, and then we're separately going to add in an electric heater as part of the system, that's when you know it might not be an integrated approach to it. A lot of questions. These are good.
There are. There's a question of if you know of any similar Mankato area resources.
Ooh, I might rely on our certs friends for some help there. I don't know. Alexis, are you aware of heat pump resources for Mankato folks?
Maybe not heat pump specifically right in that area. A lot of these statewide resources are probably great for that. But I think it's the Southeast Clean Energy Council, Southeast Minnesota, SMCEC, might have similar educational sessions and opportunities to meet on this.
Okay. Do you mind throwing in a link, Alexis, in the chat? Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. One comment here regarding the electric vendor does not allow electric resistance as backup with dual fuel electric rate being used for air or ground source heat systems. I don't know if there are other ways.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little confused by the statement of like, is that because your home is choosing a dual fuel rate, or just fundamentally the electric vendor is not allowing the electric resistance as a backup? I could understand why they would be resistant to it if you don't actually have a dual fuel system, right? If the heat pump's electrified and the electric resistance is part of the system, there isn't dual fuel. So some clarification might be helpful there to understand that a little bit better.
And then we have a question on, are you on any special reduced electric rate or are you on a standard electric rate?
Right now I'm on a standard rate. This past year, I believe, and maybe even a little earlier, that RPU created a time of use rate for homeowners. So we're looking at that pretty closely to understand. And basically what it does is encourage you to use power at certain times of the day. And as a result, they charge you less for that power during those hours of the day. I haven't figured out if that will work well for my heat pump situation yet. So we're still looking at kind of the financial impact of that opportunity. But right now we're just on a standard electric rate.
And then it looks like a follow-up comment regarding that previous statement. Dual fuel electric rates are half of the regular rate.
Do you know about this, Alexis?
Yeah, it's kind of more common rate structure in greater Minnesota, particularly in maybe a delivered fuels territory, but where folks can be have an interruptible electric heat source, say like baseboard electric heat or something like that. And then if they have like a propane forced air furnace or something as the backup, now that is their secondary heating system, so that if the utility is experiencing kind of a electric peak on the system as a whole, those homes have 2 meters. The electric heat meter is kind of shut down temporarily, and then you've got your propane backup, for example. in that case. And a lot of utilities have kind of requirements around that it has to be something that can operate like automatically, something that isn't all electric because they're trying to shave the electric situation at that moment. So that's kind of what that is. And even like there's some, I think it varies on like wood heating backup or more manual biomass systems where it may not be automatically happening. There might be some restrictions on what your backup heat can be. So that's what Andrew adds, that it's common in rural electric co-op territory, those dual fuel rates.
Gotcha. Thank you. That's
Yeah,
helpful.
although
Yeah.
it is interesting because some of the language around this right now, because folks are even calling, natural gas and electric as a dual fuel situation, which it is. But I think we've got some folks throughout the state that have that dual fuel terminology talking about money and rate structure. And some folks in the natural gas territory are just thinking about it as two systems operating and not necessarily different electric rate structures.
Gotcha. I'm familiar with that. Having lived in Maine, I had delivered propane to my house, and then we also put in a heat pump system. It wasn't integrated into like a furnace situation, but rather like that kind of classic or like condenser / wall unit connection on the outside through refrigerant lines. So thank you for that background. That's helpful. I'm seeing a couple other questions come through about do I use a common residential thermostat? The answer is yes. It's an integrated thermostat that can control both the heat pump itself and then also the operation of the resistance backup heat as needed. So it's all in one system, as well as a cooling system too, right? That's integrated with the heat pump. So controls all three. It's one thermostat. I don't think about it besides like, what am I setting my temperature settings to in my home? It has the wherewithal to kind of figure out, do I need the air conditioner to run, the heating system to run, or the electric resistance backup, depending on the outside air conditions and what I'm trying to maintain my home temperature at. And then thanks, Alexis, for putting in that resource for even colder heat pumps. I think we ran through everything.
You were mentioning the temps there, Kevin, about operating down to 5, 0, and then I think even below 0. And so you just do need to check with the contractor about the specs and the equipment. Is that like it's able to operate below that, or is it actually operating rather efficiently? And right now, some of the cold climate air source heat pumps are operating efficiently down to 5, and then they start to lose some efficiency, but are still better than running some of your other heating systems below that. So you kind of have to make a choice about where you're going to do the switch over to your secondary heating system. But this manufacturer challenge is an interesting one because they're saying stop working from modifying an air conditioner more or less and start anew and try to design a heat pump that's meant for heating and get it. You see what you can do to get it down to -15. So that's kind of flipping the design on its head.
Makes a lot of sense. There's a question about what thermostat did I use. It's a Honeywell thermostat is what we've used in our home. I'm familiar with others with like Ecobee, but there's a lot of good smart thermostats. RPU also has a smart thermostat program now available, and I'm sure other utilities have that or are developing them in order to help control demand in their utility areas, and have a list of thermostats as part of those programs that they deem smart, that in order to participate in their demand control programs too. So take a look at that, as that's helpful. Good questions.
Any other questions, either verbally or in the chat?
I do. This is Padan Pinkham. I was wondering about the advantages of doing the wall mount ones as opposed to the all house ones? If there are some, or whether there aren't any, and that kind of thing?
Yeah, they definitely exist. You can definitely use them. I had a wall mount system in a couple rooms in my house in Maine. But also to reinforce that point, usually they're meant to serve single spaces or rooms. You could look at a variable refrigerant flow system that has multiple condensers serving multiple rooms with one unit outside. So those exist too. But yeah, they work. They're efficient as well. Though in my experience, I've used them to help heat and cool in individual spaces, though you can find multi-space systems too that could work for your house.
Thank you.
Did I get in here, please? Can people hear me?
Yep.
How come nothing's been mentioned about ground source heat pumps? This has all been about just having the heat pump on the outside of the building. In northern Minnesota, you know, our climate is quite a bit colder than it is down in Rochester. And so to me, it just seems to be okay, but the problem is you got to drill the wells, and what does that cost? Is there any subsidies for the drilling of wells, or because most of us aren't not going to be able to bury a PEX tubing in the ground, because I mean, I've got a very small lot on my property here, and I doubt there's really any way that I could get a big enough heat exchanger into the ground, and it just seems to make more sense just to have a drilled well and then using that as a so then then there's plenty of heat to be had.
Yeah, there's no ground source heat pump bias here for sure. It's just, and you might hear the announcement in the background. This was more focused on air source heat pump options. Geothermal certainly works and would certainly probably be more beneficial in colder climates, as you're pointing out. You also pointed out the higher expense to drill a well. If those already exist, that could help reduce the cost if you're able to leverage that system or have the flow you need in order to integrate it into a heat pump system. So yeah, I think those are all good thoughts, and I agree. But it wasn't intentional on my end to not address those things. Just focused on air source heat pumps today.
If there's one book out there, does Saturn Resources, I don't know if they're the folks that do all of the energy efficiency auditor kind of stuff. Do they have a good book on learning this field? Heat pumps and ground source heat pumps, and
it's a good question.
Are you aware of what's a good book to read? I mean, I can tell you which one to read if you want to become an energy auditor, but what do I read to become a heat pump specialist?
That's a good question. Let me ask a couple of my colleagues and see if we can come up with a recommendation or two to include with the materials from today.
Thank you.
Yep. There is one last hand up that I think I have time for before we wrap.
Yeah, I think that's me. James, Kevin, thanks. I'm one of the people that's been peppering you with questions. And really great presentation, by the way. It's super, super good to hear your firsthand experience. Really quick background. I work for a nonprofit. Among many things, we do some housing development, both for sale and for rent. And in both cases, I think some of the would-be homeowners or residents, they have very limited experience in this area. They're not as steeped in knowledge as you are. So there's some understandable hesitation about what I'm maybe getting into, and not a lot of knowledge about how these controls work, how the integration would occur or not. And I'm going to ask you to take yourself out of your experience in your own personal home with your knowledge and think for a moment about a homeowner or a renter who has very limited experience in this area. coming to live in that space, what is your user experience difference between a furnace AC system and a heat pump system that you now have?
Sure. I mean, I would say there's no difference, right? Like my kids know how to use the thermostat. They're 8 and 6, as well as my partner. So like the heating and cooling system works. It turns on when the thermostat calls for it. I would say the difference is that the heating is a little bit cooler. Like it's not always, right? You're not burning something and capturing that heat and then distributing the heat throughout your home. So it's a different type of heat. And so you notice that, but you know, after that few days of like, you just understand that's how the system works. That's really the only user difference. But like 2 years in, there's no difference for me in terms of how my home operates or how to adjust it or things I need to do. We are at a past 1. So I think unfortunately we need to wrap, but what I am understanding is that we should talk more about heat pumps generally. So we will plan on doing that. And yeah, thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Alexis, for chiming in too. We didn't coordinate that ahead of time, just so people know. So just out of the goodness of her heart, trying to help us out. But yeah, we'll distribute these materials and we'll share these widely so that folks have them, and then we'll start thinking about other opportunities that we can share information about geothermal systems, perhaps, but help answer